It begins with silence, not the comforting kind of silence that comes after a long day, not the peaceful pause between conversations, but a silence that presses against the ears like water, closing in on a drowning body, the kind of silence that has weight, that feels as if it is waiting for something to break it. In the dim corridors of an empty workplace, that silence is never truly empty. It carries with it the faint hum of overhead lights, the whisper of ventilation through unseen ducts, and the faint creak of pipes that seem to sigh like a living thing. Alone at night, every building feels different. The walls that welcomed during the day now stand cold, their surfaces reflecting shadows that twist and stretch across the floor. Doors that were only doors begin to feel like barriers, concealing something you cannot name. The emptiness does not feel natural. It feels staged, as though the building itself is holding its breath. Imagine sitting at your desk long after your colleagues have left, the world outside buried in darkness. You hear the faint tick of the clock, the distant clatter of a settling chair, and you tell yourself it is nothing. But the longer you remain, the more you begin to notice what you should not. The elevator opens even though no one pressed the button. A chair that had been tucked neatly under a table now juts into the aisle. A hallway light flickers, though maintenance reported no faults earlier that week. And then there is the sound. The faint, deliberate rhythm of footsteps in a corridor where you know no one else remains. There are countless stories like these, whispered by night shift workers across hospitals, factories, offices, and warehouses. Stories often dismissed in daylight as stress, exhaustion, or overactive imagination, yet each one carries the same unease, the same cold edge that cannot be reasoned away. It is one thing to work alone in the hours when the world sleeps. It is another to sense that something else is awake with you, something that does not belong, and yet refuses to leave. The night has always belonged to the unseen. During the day, the world is crowded, filled with noise and movement that drown out what lurks in the corners. But when darkness falls, when the hum of human life fades to a whisper, other sounds emerge. The scrape of a chair against tile when no one has entered the room. The sound of a door slowly opening, followed by the hollow echo of it closing again. The faint shuffle of movement just beyond your vision, as though someone is there, watching but never willing to step forward. Buildings themselves change after nightfall. A hospital corridor filled with doctors and patients by day becomes a tunnel of flickering light. Each closed room a sealed space holding its own secrets. An office full of chatter and keyboards becomes a hollow chamber of reflections and shadows. A warehouse that bustled with labor now yawns with emptiness, its steel beams groaning in the darkness like tired bones. Night strips these places of their purpose and reveals something else, a sense that they were never truly meant to be empty, and that emptiness is not something they can endure quietly. One security guard once described walking his nightly rounds through an abandoned wing of an office building. The rooms were bare, the desks cleared, the windows coated in dust. Yet every night, without fail, he heard the soft murmur of voices, as though a meeting was taking place behind closed doors. When he opened those doors, silence rushed in. He stood in empty rooms, the air still and heavy, the only sound his own breath. But the moment he walked away, the murmuring began again, muffled, insistent, carrying the weight of conversations that should not exist. He never found the source. He eventually stopped trying. Another worker, tasked with cleaning a hospital ward, long after the patients had been moved to a new building, recalled the smell of antiseptic filling her nose as she pushed her cart down the empty hallway. The lights above her buzzed faintly. Halfway down the hall, she paused to adjust her gloves, and in that instant she heard it, the sound of soft breathing just over her shoulder. She froze, her skin prickling, her heart hammering. She turned, but the hallway was empty. The sound had already moved, drifting down the corridor toward the locked ward doors. She followed with trembling steps, compelled more by fear than courage, but found nothing waiting for her except silence so thick it made her dizzy. That night she finished her work with shaking hands and begged never to be assigned that wing again. Stories like these are not rare. They surface again and again, tied to the hours when most of the world is asleep. They are told in hushed tones, often with laughter to soften the edges, but the eyes of those who tell them betray something else. Fear. Memory. A reminder of moments they cannot explain. Moments that left them marked. There is always the same detail. They were alone. They were certain of it, and yet they were not. What is it about working alone at night that strips away the safety of routine and reveals something raw beneath it? Perhaps it is the human mind. exhausted and vulnerable, twisting shadows into shapes that do not exist. Perhaps it is the silence amplifying the smallest sound until it becomes unbearable. Or perhaps it is something far older, a presence that waits for the hour when only a few remain awake, watching, moving quietly through the empty spaces we leave behind. The truth is that the night reveals more than it hides. It peels away the distractions of the day and forces you to confront the unshakable question. When you are working alone in a building that was meant to hold many, who else is there with you, waiting in the dark? Every place that holds people carries with it the weight of its own history. The walls remember even if the workers forget. Hospitals remember the cries of the wounded, the last breaths of the dying. Factories remember the endless rhythm of labor, the sharp cries of accidents, the sweat and blood of bodies bent to machines. Offices remember voices that rose and fell, arguments, laughter, the quiet resignation of long nights. At night, when only one or two remain, those memories are no longer buried beneath the noise of the living. They return, faint and disjointed like echoes from another time. And it is the night shift worker who becomes the unwilling witness to these fragments. The culture of the night shift has always been one of necessity rather than choice. Few people long for it. Most accept it because someone must and because the world never truly sleeps. The night watchman, the cleaner, the nurse in the quiet ward, the clerk reconciling endless numbers in a silent office. These are the keepers of spaces abandoned by daylight. Their lives are defined by isolation. When others rest, they remain. When the building empties, they enter. That inversion of rhythm has consequences. The human body resists, but more than that, the human mind bends in strange ways when forced into solitude surrounded by the remnants of activity that should still be there. In a manufacturing plant on the edge of a small industrial town, one worker described the atmosphere at night as if the machines themselves still breathed. Even when powered down, the giant presses and conveyor belts seemed to retain a hum, a vibration that traveled through the metal floor into his shoes. He would pause to catch his breath, wipe his hands on his work clothes, and swear he heard the faint clink of tools being picked up somewhere across the cavernous room. He would search, moving through aisles of silent machines, but he always found nothing. Yet the feeling grew night after night, that someone else was working beside him, someone who never showed themselves, someone who belonged to another time. In hospitals, the night holds a different weight. Nurses and orderlies speak in low voices, their words swallowed by endless corridors. The air smells of disinfectant. The lights above buzz faintly, and the sound of a cart rolling across tile echoes louder than footsteps. Patients sleep or drift in uneasy half-consciousness, and the building itself feels as though it has slipped into another state. One nurse recalled working in an older ward, a wing scheduled to be demolished. She and a colleague passed through each room, checking equipment, making their notes. The wing was empty of patients. As she paused by a window, she caught sight of a reflection in the glass, a figure standing behind her, wearing an outdated uniform. She turned, but no one was there. She told herself it was exhaustion. But later that night, when she returned alone, she heard the faint rattle of bed rails moving. The beds were empty. She never returned to that wing again, even when asked. There is something about buildings at night that strips away the illusion of safety. During the day, with people filling the space, every sound belongs to someone. Every footstep, every door opening, every cough has a clear source. At night, those same sounds drift loose, detached from reason. A door slams in an empty corridor, and there is no one there to explain it. A phone rings at a desk long abandoned, its cord trailing across the floor. A stairwell echoes with heavy steps that do not match the lightness of your own. In those moments, the worker is left with a choice. Dismiss it as coincidence or acknowledge that they are not as alone as they believed. The psychology of night work has been studied, though rarely in connection with what the workers themselves report. Experts speak of circadian rhythms disrupted, of fatigue creating hallucinations, of loneliness sharpening the mind into imagining company. These explanations are neat, clinical, and reassuring on paper, but the workers themselves tell their stories differently. They speak with eyes lowered, voices careful, as if the words themselves might invite something back. They describe doors that opened without sound, shadows that moved without light, voices that carried through walls where no one could be. They insist they were not dreaming, not imagining, not mistaken. They insist that what they felt was real, and that the fear that lingered afterward did not fade when the sun returned. In one office tower, a clerk who often stayed late to meet deadlines admitted that she never felt truly alone. She would sit at her desk on the 22nd floor, papers spread before her, and feel a presence moving just out of sight. Sometimes it was the rustle of fabric, sometimes the pressure of someone leaning close as she wrote. She ignored it for weeks, convincing herself it was stress, until one night she dropped her pen and leaned down to retrieve it. In the reflection of her monitor, she saw someone standing over her shoulder, their face obscured, their posture rigid. She froze, her breath caught in her throat, and when she raised her head, the space behind her was empty, but the monitor's glass still quivered faintly, as though touched by a hand that had already withdrawn. Workers tell these stories not to entertain, but to unburden. They share them in quiet moments away from the work itself, often in hushed tones in break rooms or whispered over cigarettes outside. And though they try to dismiss them with nervous laughter, there is always that silence afterward, the silence of something unsaid, something unresolved. It is as though each story adds to a weight that no single person can carry alone. The truth is simple. Those who work in the hours when the world sleeps often encounter things they cannot explain. Whether those things are products of exhaustion, of the mind unraveling under the strain of isolation, or whether they are something older and darker that clings to places emptied of life, no one can say. What can be said is that the stories repeat, across places, across decades, across lives, and each one begins the same way, a worker alone in a building that feels as though it is watching them. At first, the strangeness arrived like a whisper. Small, nearly invisible details that could be explained away if one wanted to. A misplaced tool, a stack of papers that seemed to shift slightly between one glance and the next. Lights flickering in corners of the building that had not shown any sign of fault before. Each event in isolation was trivial, hardly worth remembering. But when added together, when strung along the endless hours of the night shift, they began to form a pattern. A quiet accumulation of unease. One worker stationed in an administrative office recalled how the changes always began around the same time, just after midnight. Up until then, the building behaved like any other, humming with faint electricity still holding the warmth of the day. But at the stroke of midnight, it was as though the walls themselves shifted. The air grew heavier, the silence sharpened, and the ordinary rules of the space seemed to bend. Doors that were closed would be found slightly ajar. The faint sound of typing would drift from a darkened room where no machines had been left running. He would sit at his desk holding his breath, waiting for the sound to stop. It never stopped because it never seemed to have begun in the first place. It was not like hearing a noise that ceased when you acknowledged it. It was like realizing you had been hearing it all along without noticing until now. In factories, workers spoke of shadows. The cavernous floors, lit by overhead lamps, created long stretches of darkness where the machinery cast silhouettes like skeletal limbs. But there were times when the shadows did not align. A forklift unmoving would cast a shape that seemed to twitch. The steel beams above would create lines that bent in ways that defied their structure. One man said he watched a shadow detach itself entirely, slipping from the line of a stairwell and pooling across the floor as though it were liquid. He fled the building that night and returned only because the threat of losing his job outweighed the terror of what he had seen. Hospitals are filled with noise even in the deepest hours of night. The steady beeping of machines, the shuffle of shoes across tile, the low voices of nurses. But in the wards that were no longer in use, the silence was absolute. It was there in those wings that the mystery deepened. A nurse on rotation described how she walked her rounds past locked rooms that had been cleared months earlier. She kept her eyes forward, forcing herself not to glance through the narrow windows, though she always felt the pull of them. One night, unable to resist, she looked. The room was empty, but she saw movement. A figure sitting up in the bed, its face turned toward her. She froze, her blood cold, but when she blinked, the bed was stripped bare, the sheets neatly folded, the mattress vacant. She told no one until years later. But she swore the air around her that night smelled of antiseptic and sweat. The unmistakable odor of someone ill confined to that bed. The accounts grow stranger the longer they are told. An office worker described hearing footsteps pacing directly above her. She checked the floor plan. There was no floor above. A guard reported that the fire alarm tripped in an empty warehouse. When he entered, he found the sprinklers activated in only one corner of the room, drenching the cement where a dark stain spread slowly outward, though nothing had fallen to cause it. Workers began to keep records, writing down what they experienced in private notebooks. Not to share with their supervisors because who would believe them? but to prove to themselves that they had not imagined it. And across those notebooks, the entries show the same escalation: whispers, movements, presences. The story always begins with something small, and always ends with something that defies reason. The mystery builds not because a single event stands out, but because of how each worker describes the same sequence without knowing the others had said the same. Midnight is always a threshold. Beyond it, the building no longer belongs to them. Their footsteps sound different, the air grows heavy, and an awareness creeps in. The awareness that they are not alone. Sometimes they hear breathing in a stairwell that no one is using. Sometimes they find objects rearranged in ways too deliberate to be accident. One worker found all the chairs in a conference room turned to face the door. Another returned from the restroom to find every paper on his desk stacked into a single tower, balanced with impossible precision. When these stories are retold, they gain the cadence of ritual. Workers describe the sequence of how things happen, almost like reciting a prayer of dread. First the silence, then the shift in the air, then the sound, the shadow, the movement, always in that order, as though whatever haunts these spaces follows a script older than the buildings themselves, and yet there is no explanation. Supervisors dismiss it as fatigue, as the mind's tendency to invent companions in solitude. Psychologists explain it as the natural paranoia of humans in spaces too large, too empty, too quiet. But the workers insist they know the difference. They know the weight of someone's gaze. They know the sound of footsteps that do not match their own. They know what it means to sense another presence pressing against the silence. They know because they felt it, and no explanation can erase the raw fear that followed. By the time the workers begin to believe, it is already too late. The mystery is not something that appears all at once. It builds slowly, piece by piece, until the worker is no longer certain where reality ends and where something else begins. The building does not simply hold them. It watches, and the longer they stay, the more convinced they become that it is waiting for something. What that something is, no one has yet discovered, but they all agree on one thing. Once you begin to notice, once the first detail has unsettled you, there is no turning back. The building will not let you unsee it. When the stories of night workers are placed side by side, patterns emerge like faint handwriting pressed into paper. The similarities are not easy to dismiss. Voices heard when no one was present, footsteps echoing in empty corridors, objects moved or rearranged in deliberate ways. Each account alone can be dismissed as exhaustion or coincidence, but together they form a body of testimony that resists dismissal. The deeper one looks, the more troubling the picture becomes. Security logs from certain workplaces show reports filed again and again by different guards on different nights. Always the same. Unexplained movement, sounds with no source, sudden failures of equipment. In one warehouse, cameras caught frames of movement in a locked wing, shadows sliding along the walls, shapes that seemed human but blurred when examined closely. Technicians insisted it was a technical error, light interference. Yet the guards swore that when they entered the wing, the air was charged like static, and that the feeling of being watched clung to them long after they left. Testimony from hospital staff is more personal, more visceral. A nurse described how she refused to take the service elevator after midnight. She said the elevator always stopped on the wrong floor. Even when she pressed the button for another, the doors would slide open into a hallway dark and abandoned, lined with wheelchairs and empty gurneys. She felt a pull to step out, to walk that hallway, though she knew it was unused. Each time she resisted, each time the doors closed only after a long delay, as though something was waiting for her to decide. She wrote her report to the hospital board, but they dismissed it as a malfunction even though maintenance found nothing wrong. In offices, the evidence takes stranger forms, papers arranged into impossible stacks, computer screens flickering with lines of text no one typed. One man swore he saw his own name appear again and again on a blank document, typed out letter by letter while he sat frozen in front of the screen. When he reached out to pull the cord from the wall, the screen went black instantly, as though it had been waiting for him to move. He never touched that computer again. His report was filed, noted, and forgotten. Some experts argue that the human mind under isolation is prone to distortion. They point to psychological studies where subjects kept in silence and darkness began to report hallucinations, shapes, whispers, phantom touches. They argue that the night shift worker is placed into a natural experiment, surrounded by absence and forced to remain alert. Their minds conjure company to relieve the crushing weight of solitude. This is logical, clinical, and neat, yet it does not explain why workers separated by cities by decades describe the same sequences of events in the same order. Why would hallucinations follow the same script? Others examine the architecture of the buildings themselves. They speak of drafts, structural noises, the settling of old foundations, a creak mistaken for footsteps, a vent humming like a voice. But then they must explain the shadows that move against the direction of the light, or the objects shifted in locked rooms. They must explain why workers who never spoke to each other describe the same smell of antiseptic, the same weight of silence, the same sensation of being followed. The most troubling details are those that repeat across testimonies. The exact moment of transition, just after midnight, the way air grows heavy, as if charged with something unseen, the instinctive reaction of the body, the tightening of the chest, the cold rush of fear before anything is visible. These are not simply stories of what people thought they saw. They are accounts of what they felt before sight or sound even confirmed it. A primal recognition of danger older than reason. Artifacts exist too. In one office, a night cleaner discovered a chair pushed against the door from the inside of a conference room. The room had been locked. Keys were required to enter. The cleaner called security, who forced the door open. The chair was wedged firmly against the handle, as though placed there to prevent someone leaving, not entering. No one could explain how it had been positioned. The incident was noted in the logbook, then quietly ignored. In another case, a hospital log recorded multiple calls from a phone line disconnected months earlier. Each call lasted less than 10 seconds. No voice on either end, only silence. When testimony and evidence collide, they do not resolve the mystery. They deepen it. Workers speak of being touched lightly on the shoulder, only to turn and find nothing. Guards insist they saw figures walking across loading docks, figures that did not trigger motion sensors. Cleaners tell of hearing laughter echo through stairwells, laughter that did not belong to any human voice. None of it is provable. None of it can be held in the hand. And yet each detail adds to a chorus of unease that cannot be ignored. The psychological toll is clear. Workers speak of feeling hunted, of the dread that builds each night before they return. Many leave their jobs unable to endure the weight of the unexplained. Those who stay often carry an edge of paranoia, their eyes flicking to shadows, their ears tuned for the faintest sound. They live in a state of readiness, as though bracing for something to finally reveal itself. What lies at the heart of these testimonies? Is it merely the human mind unraveling under strain, projecting fears into empty space? Or is there something in these buildings, something that awakens when the last of the daytime workers leave, when the world outside sinks into silence? No investigation has uncovered a clear answer. Every theory leaves holes, and every explanation collapses under the weight of details that do not fit. The clues are scattered, fragmented, never enough to resolve the whole. They form a picture, but one that is always blurred, always unfinished. Perhaps that is the most unsettling truth, that the workers are not hallucinating, not imagining, not inventing. They are catching glimpses of something real, something that slips through the cracks of reason, something that should not exist but does. And once you have seen the clues, once you have felt the presence, you can never return to believing you were truly alone. The body can adapt to exhaustion, but the mind fractures in subtler ways. Those who endured the night shifts in haunted silence rarely emerged unchanged. They carried something with them, not only in memory but in the shape of their thoughts, the rhythm of their days, the way their eyes lingered too long on shadows even in daylight. What begins as unease grows into a permanent wound, a reminder that solitude can take more than rest away from a person. It can take their sense of reality. One worker, a young cleaner assigned to an abandoned hospital wing, began her shifts like anyone else, tired, resigned, convinced the stories were exaggerations meant to frighten new staff. For weeks she worked without incident, but then came the sound. At first faint, barely there, like water dripping in another room, a slow rhythmic tap that echoed in the silence. She tried to ignore it, but the sound followed her through the corridors, always near, always just beyond the corner. She completed her tasks quickly, rushing through the halls, her pulse racing. After several nights, she told herself it was nothing. But then one evening, she heard her name whispered in that same rhythm, spoken low and intimate, as though someone leaned close to her ear. She fled in panic, abandoning her cart and equipment. When she returned days later to collect them, she stood in the ward doorway, unable to cross the threshold. She said later she felt as though the building itself remembered her and was waiting for her to return. Fear of the unseen has a way of invading daily life. Workers reported sleeplessness, waking in the night to sounds that echoed those they had heard on shift. One man described lying in bed and hearing the steady shuffle of feet pacing his hallway at home, though no one else lived with him. Another said she could not look into mirrors after midnight, afraid that she might see what had once lingered behind her in her office window. Families spoke of changes, too. A father who had worked alone in a warehouse came home silent, withdrawn, his eyes scanning the corners of his own kitchen as though expecting someone to step out of them. A mother who had served as a night nurse grew restless, checking doors and locks repeatedly, never satisfied that the house was safe. There is a weight to carrying such experiences, especially when they cannot be shared. Most who endured them found no sympathy when they tried to speak. Supervisors dismissed their reports. Colleagues laughed or shook their heads. Families urged them to sleep, to eat better, to calm down. But fear does not vanish because it is dismissed. It festers. It grows heavier in silence. So many workers stopped speaking at all. They kept their memories locked inside, their dread unspoken. And in that isolation, the fear sharpened into something else: obsession. Some workers began to keep journals, chronicling each night in careful detail. They tracked the patterns, the times, the sensations. What had begun as an attempt to control their fear often deepened it, as the entries revealed consistency that no one wanted to admit. The same hour, the same sequence of silence, movement, presence. One guard described how, reading back through his own notes, he realized he had written the word watching on nearly every page, as if it had pressed itself into his mind against his will. He burned the journals afterward, but he admitted the word still whispered in his head when he walked alone. Paranoia seeped into relationships. Spouses complained of being watched in their own homes, not by strangers but by the haunted gazes of those they loved. Friends noticed how laughter no longer reached the eyes of those who had endured long nights in empty buildings. Some workers quit outright, abandoning jobs they had held for years rather than endure one more shift. Others remained, tied by need or stubbornness, but they lived with constant dread. They spoke of dreading not just what they might see, but what the fear itself was doing to them. One said, "It was not that I thought something was there. It was that I began to think it would never leave me, even if I left the building." The psychological damage is not always loud. It does not always erupt in panic or collapse. Often it lingers quietly like a bruise beneath the skin, a sense of unease that never fades, a constant edge of suspicion. Workers spoke of double-checking shadows, of counting their steps in hallways to reassure themselves they were still alone. They admitted that sometimes, even surrounded by people in daylight, they felt a presence pressing close, reminding them of the hours when they had been isolated. The most devastating accounts come from those who broke entirely. A hospital orderly who refused to enter a certain ward began to mutter about patients who were not alive yet still demanded his attention. An office clerk who once laughed about her late nights resigned after she found herself screaming at the reflection of a man she swore she had seen in her monitor. A security guard who patrolled empty schools at night reported voices calling his name so often that he began to answer aloud, until one night he stopped answering altogether, convinced that if he responded again, something would finally answer back. These are not stories of simple superstition. They are stories of people undone by what they could not control, what they could not escape, what they could not explain. Their trauma is not measured in statistics or reports, but in the quiet unraveling of their lives, in the way they looked at the world afterward, in the way their families noticed that something in them had changed forever. Perhaps the most unsettling truth is that fear does not require proof. It requires only experience. And once a person has felt the cold press of an unseen presence, once they have heard their name whispered in an empty room, once they have looked into a reflection and seen someone else staring back, no argument, no dismissal, no daylight reassurance can undo it. The fear lives on and it waits, reminding them that whatever they encountered in those long, lonely nights, it was real enough to scar them. Whenever stories of the night shift spread beyond whispers, the first response is almost always the same: investigation. Supervisors demand explanations, management request reports, and security companies send technicians with clipboards and tools. They come armed with logic, with procedure, with the belief that every disturbance has a source, that every shadow has an explanation. Cameras are installed in dark hallways. Locks are replaced on doors. Floors are inspected for faults. The measures are thorough, precise, and confident. Yet the findings, more often than not, are inconclusive. A factory plagued by unexplained noises during late shifts brought in engineers to examine the machines. They worked through the night, testing gears, wiring, ventilation. Everything functioned as expected. Yet the following night, the workers still heard the heavy clank of tools dropped onto concrete, even though no tools had been left on the floor. The engineers shrugged, their diagrams flawless, their reports neat. Fatigue, they said. The mind exaggerates. But those who worked there insisted that fatigue could not explain why the sounds grew louder when they tried to ignore them, or why the echoes seemed to follow them no matter where they went. In hospitals, official reviews took the form of safety audits. Inspectors walked the halls with clipboards, noting exit signs, counting beds, verifying procedures. When nurses spoke of locked wards where breathing could be heard, the inspectors wrote ventilation malfunction. When cleaners spoke of shadows moving in sterile rooms, the notes read lighting interference. Everything was filed, boxed, and dismissed. Yet the staff who worked those wings at night continued to feel the same dread, continued to whisper to one another about the weight of unseen eyes. No audit could erase the memory of seeing a figure at the end of the corridor when the wing had been officially empty. Security firms, tasked with proving the safety of their patrols, installed cameras in offices and warehouses. The footage often revealed something, though never what was expected. Sometimes it showed nothing at all, while guards reported hearing entire conversations taking place nearby. Other times the cameras captured flickers, frames where something moved quickly past, too fast to identify, yet distinct enough to resemble a human shape. Analysts slowed the footage, zoomed in, rewound, and still the images blurred into nonsense. Glitch, they said. Artifact. But the workers who walked those halls saw no glitch in the way the air grew colder after midnight, or in the way their hair stood on end at the exact moment the blur crossed the screen. Conspiracy theories bloomed in the absence of clear answers. Some said the buildings themselves were cursed, built on grounds where tragedies had taken place, where blood had soaked too deeply into the soil to ever fade. Old records sometimes lent weight to these claims. A warehouse in one city was discovered to have been constructed on the site of a collapsed factory where dozens of laborers had died. An office tower stood on the ruins of a theater that had burned to the ground, trapping its audience inside. A hospital wing had been closed not for structural reasons but because of a string of deaths that could not be explained by medical science. For those who searched deeply enough, the past whispered its own grim possibilities. Others suggested more calculated causes. They believed the strangeness was manufactured, a tool of control. Workers frightened into silence, into compliance, into leaving questions unasked. They pointed to the way management so easily dismissed testimony, the way evidence was downplayed or destroyed. Perhaps the workers were not meant to uncover the truth of what haunted them, because the truth served someone else's purpose. Hidden experiments. Controlled exposure to fear. Buildings turned into cages, not for the body but for the mind. Theories like these spread quietly, traded between employees who no longer trusted those above them. Paranormal explanations, though less accepted in public, were spoken most often in private. Some believed the presences were remnants of those who had died in the buildings, bound by unfinished business. Others claimed they were not human at all, but echoes, fragments of something older, something that fed on isolation. Workers described the sense of being drained, of leaving their shifts not only tired but hollowed, as though something had taken a piece of them. A few spoke of seeing faces and reflective surfaces, faces that were not their own, lingering just long enough to be recognized before fading into glass. The most unsettling theory of all came not from experts, nor from conspiracy, nor from whispers of ghosts, but from the workers themselves. Some began to wonder aloud if the buildings did not hold presences, but if the buildings were the presences, the creak of the beams, the hum of the lights, the breath of the ventilation, they were not signs of something moving within the structure, but signs that the structure itself was alive in some way that defied comprehension. One guard said, "It felt like the building was dreaming and I was inside it, part of it, unable to wake." The thought spread like a disease, and once it took hold, it was impossible to ignore. The sensation of being watched was not from a figure hidden in the shadows, but from the walls themselves, the ceiling itself, the very floor beneath their feet. Despite countless reports, official investigations never reached a final conclusion. Each explanation contradicted another. Each theory left holes that could not be filled. Fatigue could not explain objects moved. Architecture could not explain voices calling names. Glitches could not explain cold air that pressed against skin like hands. Paranormal theories offered a framework, but no answers. And so the mystery remained unresolved, growing heavier each year as new workers entered the same buildings, encountered the same experiences, and told the same stories. Perhaps the greatest failure of the investigations was not that they found nothing, but that they pretended nothing was there. Theories piled upon theories, yet none addressed the simplest, most human truth. The people who worked those nights were afraid. Their fear was real, their trauma undeniable, and whether the cause was psychological, historical, or supernatural, the effect was the same. Something was happening in those buildings in those hours when the world turned away, something that would not be dismissed no matter how many reports were written. In the end, all the investigations left behind was another question, heavier than the first. What if the buildings do not want to give us the truth? What if the mystery is not meant to be solved but endured? The stories do not end when the shift is over. The clock may strike morning, the sun may rise, the city may wake, but those who have walked the halls of empty buildings at night carry something with them that daylight cannot erase. Fear has a way of lingering. It does not leave when the light returns. It waits quietly, hiding in memory and silence in the corners of familiar rooms. For those who have endured nights alone at work, the question is never fully answered. Did they imagine it? Or did they encounter something that lives just beyond the reach of reason? In the retelling, the stories often sound fragmented, uncertain. A guard swears he heard voices in a sealed warehouse, but hesitates as he explains. A nurse insists she saw a figure in a locked room, but her voice falters at the memory. Workers speak with long pauses, as if choosing words too carelessly might invite the presence back. Their accounts may differ in detail, but the emotion is always the same. Dread, not of what they saw, but of what they felt. A fear deeper than explanation. A fear that once planted never fades. Perhaps this is why the stories continue to spread, carried not as entertainment, but as warning. They serve as reminders that solitude is not as empty as it seems, that the night is not as still as we want to believe. The workers who lived through it did not return with evidence, with photographs, with proof. What they returned with was something more unsettling, the certainty that they were not alone, and the conviction that what shared those hours with them was not human. The buildings themselves seem to hold the weight of these stories. Walk through them in daylight and you will notice it if you are attentive. A chill in the air in one hallway while the rest is warm. A faint smell of antiseptic in a room long unused. The uneasy silence of a stairwell, as though sound refuses to linger there. Visitors dismiss these details as quirks of architecture, accidents of maintenance. But to those who have worked there after midnight, they are not quirks. They are signs. The building remembers. The building waits. Some workers leave their jobs and never look back, determined to shut the door on those experiences forever. Yet even they admit that the fear follows. It creeps into new jobs, into new homes. It returns in moments of solitude. Sitting alone in an office after hours, they feel it again. The weight of unseen eyes, the shift in the air, the faint sound of something moving in the distance. The environment may change, but the sensation does not. It is as if once the presence finds you, it does not let you go. For others, the obsession deepens. They read about haunted places, about theories of residual energy, about structures that hold the imprint of trauma. They revisit the building, searching for what they once fled. They tell themselves that if they can face it again, perhaps they can understand it. But understanding never comes. The presence is elusive, refusing to show itself fully, offering only glimpses and sounds. It thrives not on being seen, but on being suspected. It feeds not on confrontation, but on uncertainty. The question remains, whispered by those who have lived it and those who listen. What is it that inhabits these empty places at night? Is it the memory of the dead, lingering in walls that once bore witness to their final breaths? Is it something born of the buildings themselves, something that awakens only when the lights dim and silence falls? Or is it something older, something that does not belong to the human world at all, something that uses our spaces only as stages for its presence? No theory satisfies. No explanation resolves the unease. The truth slips away, leaving only the fear behind, and perhaps that is the most chilling part of these stories. They have no end. They do not resolve like tales told to children, with neat answers or comforting closure. They linger unresolved because they are not meant to be solved. They are meant to remind us of something we try desperately to forget, that we are never truly alone. The next time you stay late, alone in your office or walk the halls of an empty hospital, or patrol the quiet expanse of a warehouse, remember these stories. Remember the workers who heard their names whispered in deserted rooms, who saw shadows move against the light, who felt breath on their skin when no one was near. Remember the silence that was not silence, the stillness that was not still. And then ask yourself, when you hear the faint sound of footsteps behind you, when you catch a shadow in the corner of your eye, when you feel the air change though no door has opened, are you certain you are alone? The workers who live these nights would tell you they are certain of one thing, that certainty itself is the lie.